let's talk about measure of dispersion. Now, measure of dispersion is basically what happens. This measure will tell you how the data is spread and what is the how the data is scattered. Basically, if suppose if assume that this is the data, all the data's values are somewhere inside here. Okay. Now you find the mean value, you get the centered value, correct? At the same time, if I want to know how the each data is, scattered, or what is the distance between average distance between each of the data from the mean value, in that condition we are going to find out measure of dispersion. So which generally gives you that what is the spread or what is the scatteredness of the data from the mean value. So under measure of dispersion we have two different type of things that we are going to study, that is absolute measure and the relative measure. So first we will talk about absolute measure. So under absolute measure, the first thing we will be talking about the range. What is the range of the data? Okay. Similarly, next thing we will be talking about, that is quartile deviation. Quartile deviation. Okay. Next we will be talking about mean deviation. And the fourth thing we'll talk about, standard deviation. Okay. Similarly, we have another thing called as the relative measure. Now under this what happened? All this method, whatever you have studied, the coefficient of this will be studied. For example, coefficient of range, then coefficient of this, we call it as a QD. Okay, this we denote with MD and this we denote with SD. So coefficient of QD, similarly coefficient of mean deviation and coefficient of standard deviation, which is also called as coefficient of variation. Okay, coefficient of variation. So these are the few methods that we are going to study under measure of dispersion, that is absolute measure as well as the relative measure. So we'll talk one by one about range, quartile deviation, mean deviation and standard deviation, each one of it. Right? So pause the video, make a note of it. So under dispersion, let's talk about the range. So range we have already seen in the tally marking chapter. It's called highest value minus lowest value. So generally it calculates in the ungrouped data. So wherever the ungrouped data is given, you just find out what is the highest value, among that you subtract from the lowest value, whatever you get, that is a range of that particular data, right? And when I talk about the coefficient of range is generally the highest value minus lowest value divided by highest value plus lowest value. Very simple it is. So let's take one example. For example, if they are given 7, 12, 20, 1, 15, 6, 5, 4, 3, 8, 7 and so on, right? This is the data they have given and they ask you to calculate the range. So what can we do? Very simple it is. What is the highest value over here? Can you see? 20. And what is the lowest value? That is 1. So find out. So range will be highest value minus lowest value, which is nothing but 20 minus 1, which is nothing but 19. And if I have to talk about coefficient of range, what will happen is highest value minus lowest value divided by highest value plus lowest value. So it will be 20 minus 1 by 20 plus 1. So 19 by 21. So the range is very simple. to calculate where the highest minus lowest just you have to do. That's it, nothing more and no more deviation here. So it is very simple to calculate. I hope you are able to understand this, right? Few more questions I will put it for your practice. You just solve that question. Next topic what we are going to discuss is something called as quartile deviation. Quartile deviation, we also called as QD. So generally what happened in quartile deviation is we have already learned how to calculate the quartile. I'm not going to teach you once again because again the video will become very lengthy and it's not very attractive as well, since we have already done it. In case if you don't know, please go to the quartile videos and refer watch once again. So quartile deviation is very simple, that in this we have two things. The first one we call it as a semi-interquartile range. Okay, now understand this meaning, what it is mean. It means interquartile range and semi-interquartile range. So interquartile, suppose if I remove this is semi basically, if I remove this interquartile range, what do you understand this? So quartile is what? Q1, Q2, Q3. So range of the quartile if you have to check, of course the highest value in the quartile is Q3 and the lowest value is in the quartile is Q1, right? The interquartile range will be Q1 minus Q3. At the same time, if they are talking about semi-interquartile range, what are you going to do? That is divide by 2. Of course it is divide by 2, which is nothing but the quartile deviation. Quartile deviation and semi-interquartile range are same. So let me just tell here that semi-interquartile range, which is also called as quartile deviation, which is nothing but Q3 minus Q1 by 2. Either they are asking semi-interquartile range or quartile deviation, it is Q3 minus Q1 by 2. Now you know very well how to calculate Q1 and Q3. I'm not going to teach you once again, right? So if you know the formula, you know how to calculate the quartile, easily you can find out whatever it is given. Similarly, if I have to talk about the coefficient of quartile deviation, which is nothing but Q3 minus Q1 divided by Q3 plus Q1. Remember, the positive sign will always come down. Okay, let's talk one question. Assume that if Q3 is equal to 17 and Q1 is equal to 5 and they ask you to find out some quartile deviation. So what will happen? Quartile deviation is equal to 17 minus 5 by 2, which is nothing but 12 by 2, which is nothing but 6. At the same time, quartile deviation coefficient will what? That is Q3 minus Q1 by Q3 plus Q1. So it is 17 minus 5 by 17 plus 5, which is nothing but 12 by 22. Right, so this is how you can solve it. And some generally they don't give the Q1 and Q3 directly. You will have to find out based on what the data it is. We have already taught that. So I hope you are able to understand this. Pause the video, make a note of it. That's it about the quartile deviation. Next we will move on to the mean deviation. We will see what exactly is going to happen. Right, so pause the video, note it down.